So, hello and welcome back yet again. We are back with Jules Verne, who is taking us around the world in 80 days. Sometime, eventually, maybe. We'll have to wait and see. The first chapter was pretty good. It definitely established the character of our, I'm assuming, protagonist, and did it in kind of a humorous way. I do love that about Jules Verne. That is something I really appreciate about him. Anyway, we're going to read chapter 2, though, and I am looking forward to it. So, we are going to be reading chapter 2 of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. And chapter 2 is titled In Which Passepartout is Convinced That He Has at Last Found His Ideal. I love these long chapter titles. Faith, murmured Passepartout, somewhat flurried. I've seen people at Madame Toussaint's as lively as my new master. Madame Toussaint's people, let it be said, are made of wax, and are much visited in London. Speech is all that is required to make them human. During his brief interview with Mr. Fogg, Passepartout had been carefully observing him. He appeared to be a man about 40 years of age, with fine, handsome features and a tall, well-shaped figure. His hair and whiskers were light, his forehead compact and unwrinkled, his face rather pale, but his teeth magnificent. His countenance possessed in the highest degree what people call repose in action, a quality of those who act rather than talk. Calm and phlegmatic, with a clear eye, Mr. Fogg seemed a perfect type of that English composure which Angelica Kauffmann has so skillfully represented on canvas. Seen in the various phases of his daily life, he gave the idea of being perfectly well balanced, as exactly regulated as a Leroy chronometer. Phileas Fogg was indeed exactitude personified, and this was betrayed even in the expression of his hands and feet, for in men, as well as in animals, the limbs themselves are expressive of their passions. He was so exact that he was never in a hurry, was always ready, and was economical alike of his steps and motions. He never took one step too many, and always went to his destination by the shortest cut. He made no superfluous gestures, and was never seemed to be moved or agitated. He was the most deliberate person in the world, yet always reached his destination at the exact moment. He lived alone, and so to speak, outside of every social relation, and as he knew that in this world account must be taken of friction, and that friction retards, he never rubbed up against anyone. As for Passepartout, he was a true Parisian of Paris. Since he had abandoned his own country for England, taking service as a valet, he had in vain searched for a master after his own heart. Passepartout was by no means one of those pert dunces depicted by Moliere. With a bold gaze and nose held high in the air, he was an honest fellow, with a pleasant face, lips a trifle protruding, and soft-mannered and serviceable, with a good round head, such as one likes to see on the soldier's shoulders of a friend. His eyes were blue, his complexion rubicund, his figure almost portly and well built, his body muscular, and his physical powers fully developed by the exercise of his younger days. His brown hair was somewhat tumbled, for while the ancient sculptors are said to have known 18 methods of arranging Minerva's tresses, Passepartout was familiar with but one of dressing his own hair. 3 strokes of a large tooth comb completed his entire toilette. It would be rash to predict how Passepartout's lively nature would agree with Mr. Fogg. It was impossible to tell whether the new servant would turn out as absolutely methodical as his master required. Experience alone would solve that question. Passepartout had been a sort of vagrant in his early years, and now yearned for repose, but so far he had failed to find it, though he had already served 10 English houses. But he could not take root in any of these. With chagrin, he found his masters invariably whimsical and irregular, constantly running about the country or out looking for adventure. His last master, young Lord Longferry, Member of Parliament, after passing his nights in the Haymarket taverns, was all too often brought home in the morning upon a policeman's shoulders. Passepartout, desirous of respecting the gentleman whom he served, ventured a mild scolding on such conduct, which, being poorly received, made him take his leave. Hearing that Mr. Phileas Fogg was looking for a servant, and that his life was one of unbroken regularity, that he neither traveled or stayed away from home overnight, Passepartout felt sure that this would be the place he was after. He presented himself and was accepted, as we have seen. At 11:30, then, Passepartout found himself alone in the house on Savile Row. He began his inspection without delay, scouring from cellar to garret. So clean, well arranged, solemn a mansion pleased him. It seemed to him like a snail shell, lit and warmed by gas, which sufficed for both of these purposes. When Passepartout reached the second story, he recognized at once the room that he was to inhabit, and was well satisfied with it. Electric bells and speaking tube afforded communion with the lower stories, while up on the mantel stood an electric clock, precisely like the one in Mr. Fogg's bedchamber, both beating the same second at the same instant. "This is good. That'll do," said Passepartout to himself. He suddenly observed, hung over the clock, a card which, upon inspection, proved to be a program of the daily routine of the house. It comprised all that was required of the servant from 8 in the morning, exactly at which hour Phileas Fogg rose, till 11:30, when he left the house for the Reform Club. All the details of service, the tea and the toast at 23 minutes past 8, the shaving water at 37 minutes past 9, and the toilette at 20 minutes before 10. Everything was regulated and foreseen that was to be done from 11:30 a.m. till midnight, the hour at which the methodical gentleman retired. Mr. Fogg's wardrobe was amply supplied and in the best taste. Each pair of trousers, coat, and vest bore a number indicating the time of year and season at which time they were in turn to be laid out for wearing, and the same system was applied to the master's shoes. In short, the house in Savile Row, which must have been a very temple of disorder and unrest under the illustrious but dissipated Sheridan, was coziness, comfort, and method idealized. There was no study, nor were there any books, which would have been quite useless to Mr. Fogg, for at the Reform 2 libraries, one of general literature and the other of law and politics, were always at his service. A moderate-sized sofa stood in his bedroom, constructed so as to defy both fire and burglars, but Passepartout found neither arms nor hunting weapons anywhere. Everything he saw betrayed the most tranquil and peaceable of all habits. Having searched the house from top to bottom, he rubbed his hands together, and a broad smile spread over his features, and he joyfully said to himself, This is just what I wanted. Ah, we shall get on together, Mr. Fogg and I. What a domestic and regular gentleman, a real machine. Well, I don't mind serving a machine. And that is the end of chapter 2. I do think we are going to go on to chapter 3 after I grab a real quick drink. And now, on to chapter 3. In which a conversation takes place which seems likely to cost Phileas Fogg dear. Phileas Fogg, having shut the door of his house at 11:30, and having put his right foot before his left 575 times, and his left foot before his right 576 times, reached the Reform Club, an imposing edifice in Pall Mall, which could not have cost less than 3 millions. He repaired at once to the dining room, the 9 windows of which opened upon a tasteful garden where the trees were already gilded with an autumn coloring, and he took his place at the habitual table, the cover of which had already been laid for him. His breakfast consisted of a side dish, a broiled fish with reading sauce, a scarlet slice of roast beef garnished with mushrooms, a rhubarb and gooseberry tart, and a morsel of Cheshire cheese, the whole being washed down with several cups of tea, for which the Reform was famous. He rose at 13 minutes to 1 and directed his steps towards the large hall, a sumptuous apartment adorned with lavishly framed paintings. A flunkey handed him an uncut Times, which he proceeded to cut with a skill that betrayed familiarity with this delicate operation. The perusal of this paper absorbed Phileas Fogg until 4:15, whilst the Standard, his next task, occupied him until the dinner hour. Dinner passed as breakfast had done, and Mr. Fogg reappeared in the reading room and sat down to the Pall Mall at 20 minutes before 6. Half an hour later, several members of the Reform came in and drew up to the fireplace where a coal fire was steadily burning. They were Mr. Fogg's usual partners at whist. Andrew Stewart, an engineer, John Sullivan and Samuel Folleton, bankers, Thomas Flanagan, a brewer, and Gauthier Ralph, one of the directors of the Bank of England. All rich and highly respectable people, even in a club which comprises the princes of English trade and finance. "Well, Ralph," said Thomas Flanagan, "what about that robbery?" "Oh," said Stewart, "the bank will lose the money." "On the contrary," broke in Ralph, "I hope we may put our hands on the robber. Skillful detectives have been sent to all the principal ports of America and the continent, and he'll be a clever fellow if he slips through their fingers." "But have you got the robber's description?" said Stewart. "In the first place, he's no robber at all," said Ralph. "What? A fellow who makes off with £50,000 not a robber?" "No." "Perhaps he's a manufacturer, then." "The Daily Telegraph says that he is a gentleman." It was Phileas Fogg, whose head now emerged from behind the newspaper, who had made this remark. He bowed to his friends and entered the conversation. The affair which formed its subject, and which was the town's talk, had occurred 3 days before at the Bank of England. A package of banknotes, to the value of £55,000, had been taken from the principal's cashier's table, that functionary at the moment being engaged in registering the receipt of 3 shillings and a sixpence. Of course, he could not have had his eyes everywhere. Let it be observed that the Bank of England reposes a touching confidence in the honesty of the public. There are neither guards nor gratings to protect its treasures. Gold and silver and banknotes are freely exposed at the mercy of every comer. A keen observer of English customs relates that being in one of the rooms of the bank one day, he had the curiosity to examine a gold ingot weighing some 6 or 7 or 8 pounds. He took it up, scrutinized it, passed it to his neighbor, he to the next man, and so on until the ingot, going from hand to hand, was transferred to the very end of the dark entry. Nor did it return to its place for at least half an hour. Meanwhile, the cashier had not so much as even raised his head. But in the present instance, things had not gone quite so smoothly. The package of notes not being found when 5 o'clock sounded from the ponderous clock in the drawing office, the amount was passed to the account of profit and loss. As soon as the robbery was discovered, picked detectives hastened off to Liverpool, Glasgow, Havre, Suez, Brinsley, New York, and other ports, inspired by the offered reward of £2,000 and 5% on the sum that was recovered. Detectives were also charged with narrowly watching those who arrived or left London by rail, and a judicial examination was at once entered upon. There were real grounds for supposing, as the Daily Telegraph said, that the thief did not belong to a professional band. On the day of the robbery, a well-dressed gentleman of polished manners and with a well-to-do air had been observed going to and fro in the paying room where the crime had been committed. A description of this man was easily procured and sent to the detectives and some hopeful spirits, of whom Ralph was one, and they did not despair of his apprehension. The papers and clubs were full of the affair, and everywhere people were discussing the probabilities of a successful pursuit, and the Reform Club was especially agitated as several of its members were bank officials. Ralph would not concede that the work of the detectives was likely to be in vain, for he thought that the prize offered would greatly stimulate their zeal and activity, but Stewart was far from sharing this confidence, and as they placed themselves at the whist table, they continued arguing about the matter. Stewart and Flanagan played together, while Phileas Fogg and had Valentine for his partner. As the game proceeded, the conversation ceased, except between the rubbers, when it would revive again. "I maintain," said Stewart, "that the chances are in favor of the thief, who must be a shrewd fellow." "Well, where can he fly to?" said Ralph. "No country is safe for him." "Pshaw!" "Where could he go, then?" "Oh, I don't know. The world's big enough." "It was once," said Phileas Fogg in a low voice. "Cut, sir," he said, handing the cards to Thomas Flanagan. The discussion fell during the rubber, after which Stewart took up its thread. "What do you mean by once? Has the world gotten smaller?" "Certainly," said Ralph. "I agree with Mr. Fogg. The world has grown smaller, since a man can now go around it 10 times more quickly than 100 years ago. And that's why the search for this thief will be most likely to succeed." "And also why the thief can get away more easily." "Be so good as to play, Mr. Stewart," said Phileas Fogg. But the incredulous Mr. Stewart was not convinced, and when the hand was finished, said eagerly, "You have a strange way, Ralph, of proving that the world has grown smaller. So, because you can go around it in 3 months—" "80 days," said Phileas Fogg. "That's true, gentlemen," said John Sullivan. "Only 80 days, now that the section between Rothal and Alborad on the Great Indian Peninsula Railway has been opened. Here's the estimate made by the Daily Telegraph. From London to Suez via Mont Cenis and Brundsea by rail and steamboat, 7 days. From Suez to Bombay by steamer, 13 days. From Bombay to Calcutta by rail, 3 days. From Calcutta to Hong Kong by steamer, 13 days. From Hong Kong to Yokohama by steamer, 6 days. From Yokohama to San Francisco by steamer, 22 days. From San Francisco to New York by rail, 7 days. From New York to London by steamer and rail, 9 days, for a total of 80 days. Yes, in 80 days, said Stuart, who in his excitement made a false deal. But that doesn't take into account bad weather, contrary winds, shipwrecks, railway accidents, and the like. All included, said Phileas Fogg, who continued to play despite the discussion. But suppose people pull up the rails, said Stuart. Suppose they stop the trains, pillage the luggage vans, scalp the passengers. It's all included, said Fogg calmly as he threw down his card. 2 trumps. Stuart, whose turn it was to deal, gathered them up and went on. You're right theoretically, Mr. Fogg, but practically... Practically as well, Mr. Stuart. I'd like to see you do it in 80 days. That depends on you. Shall we go? Oh, heaven preserve me. But I would wager £4,000 that such a journey made under these conditions is impossible. On the contrary, it's quite possible, said Mr. Fogg. Well, make it then. The journey round the world in 80 days? Yes. I would like nothing better. When? At once. Only, I warn you, I shall do it at your expense. That's absurd, said Stuart, who was beginning to be annoyed at the persistence of his friend. Come, let's get on with the game. Deal over again, then, said Phileas Fogg. There's a false deal. Stuart took up the pack with feverish hands and then suddenly threw them down again. Well, Mr. Fogg, he said, it'll be so. I'll wager 4,000 on it. Calm yourself, my dear Stuart, said Valentine. It's only a joke. When I say I'll wager, said Stuart, I mean it. All right, said Mr. Fogg, and turning to the others continued. I have a deposit of 20,000 at Barings, which I will willingly risk upon it. 20,000 pounds, said Sullivan. 20,000 pounds, when you would lose by one accidental delay. The unforeseen does not exist, quietly said Phileas Fogg. But, Mr. Fogg, 80 days are the only estimate of the least possible time which the journey could be made. A well-used minimum suffices for all. But in order not to exceed it, you must jump mathematically from trains upon the steamers and from steamers upon trains again. And so I will jump mathematically. You're joking. A true Englishman does not joke when he is talking about such a serious thing as a wager, said Phileas Fogg. I will bet 20,000 pounds against anyone who wishes that I will make the tour of the world in 80 days or less, in 1,920 hours, or 115,200 minutes. Do you accept? We accept, said Mr. Stuart and Valentine, Sullivan, Flanagan, and Ralph, after they had discussed it. Good, said Mr. Fogg. The train leaves for Dover at 9:15, and I will take it. This very evening, said Stuart. This very evening, said Phileas Fogg. He took out and consulted a pocket almanac and added, As today is Wednesday, the 2nd of October, I shall be due in London in this very room of the Reform Club on Saturday, the 21st of December, at a quarter before 9 p.m., or else the £20,000 now deposited in my name at Barings will belong to you. In fact and in right, gentlemen. Here is a check for the amount. A memorandum of the wager was at once drawn up and signed by 6 parties, during which Phileas Fogg preserved a stoic composure. He certainly did not bet to win, and had only staked the £20,000, half his fortune, because he foresaw that he might have to extend the other half to carry out this difficult, not to say unattainable, project. As for his antagonists, they seemed quite agitated, not so much by the value of their stake, as that they had some scruples about benefiting under conditions that would be so difficult for their friend. The clock struck 7, and the party offered to suspend the game so that Mr. Fogg might make his preparations for the departure. "I'm quite ready to go right now," was his tranquil response. "Diamonds are trumps. Be so good as to play, my friends." And that was the end of chapter 3. All right, well, now we know why he's going around the world in 80 days. I mean, you could do it now. Could you really do it back in the 1800s? I think I would probably bet against it. Not gonna lie. I don't know that I believe that back then you could actually do it when one disaster on the road and your timeline is toast. But that's the whole point behind the book. So there we go. Hope that you enjoyed that 2-chapter evening, and I will see you later.